Rancher rode the same trail daily, until he saw 10 Apaches blocking it. Thomas Blackwood adjusted his weathered Stetson against the harsh Arizona sun as he guided his mare, Sadie, along the familiar trail that cut through Whitetail Canyon. The year was 1878, and for the past 8 years, Thomas had traveled this same route daily between his modest cattle ranch and the growing settlement of Copper Springs. The path was etched into his memory as deeply as the lines on his sun-beaten face. Every boulder, every twist of the narrow passage, every place where the ground dipped suddenly beneath a horse's hooves. "Come on, girl," he murmured to Sadie, patting her neck as they navigated a particularly rocky stretch. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. At 43, Thomas carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had carved his existence from the unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory. His ranch, the Crooked Arrow, wasn't the largest in the county, but it was his, paid for with 15 years of sweat and determination after he'd left Tennessee following the war. The conflict had taken his brother and left Thomas with a slight limp from a Confederate bullet at Shiloh, but he rarely dwelled on those memories anymore. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side of him, creating a natural corridor that funneled the autumn breeze. Yellow and rust-colored leaves from scattered cottonwoods tumbled across the trail. It was early October, and the brutal summer heat had finally relented, giving way to days that were almost pleasant and nights that required an extra blanket. Thomas was returning from Copper Springs with supplies: coffee, flour, ammunition, and a small bag of peppermint candies that he pretended were for his ranch hands, but were mostly for himself. The saddlebags also contained a letter from his sister in Nashville and a copy of the Copper Springs Sentinel, which he would read by lantern light after supper. As he rounded a bend in the trail, the canyon widened slightly into a small clearing where travelers sometimes camped. Thomas noticed fresh hoof prints in the dirt and the remains of a small fire. Nothing unusual. This trail, while not heavily trafficked, saw its share of travelers, prospectors, and the occasional military patrol from Fort Wendell, 20 miles to the north. He was about to pass through when he noticed something unusual, a distinctive set of tracks crossing the trail. Thomas reined Sadie to a halt and dismounted to examine them more closely. The impressions were fresh, made within the last few hours. He recognized them immediately as unshod horses, Apache ponies. His stomach tightened. A small group, moving fast, heading east toward the mountains. The Apache had largely been peaceful in this particular region for the past 2 years, since the treaty with the White Mountain Bands. But rumors had been circulating in Copper Springs about a group of warriors who had broken away from the reservation at San Carlos, led by a young war leader named Nahilze. The Indian agent had dismissed these stories, but the cavalry at Fort Wendell had increased their patrols. Thomas remounted Sadie and continued down the trail with heightened alertness. His ranch was only 4 miles ahead, but the trail narrowed through a section locals called the Needle's Eye, a tight passage between 2 sheer rock faces, barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass side by side. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Thomas had always been careful when passing through it. As he approached the Needle's Eye, he slowed Sadie to a walk. The shadows were growing longer as the afternoon sun dipped toward the western horizon. Thomas loosened his Colt revolver in its holster and slung his Winchester repeater across his lap instead of keeping it in its scabbard. The entrance to the narrow passage looked the same as always, quiet and unremarkable. Thomas strained his ears for any unusual sounds. Birds chirped from the scrub brush along the canyon walls. A slight breeze stirred the dust on the trail. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the uneasiness that had settled in his gut when he'd seen those tracks hadn't dissipated. He guided Sadie into the passage, moving at a steady pace, eyes constantly scanning the rocks above and ahead. Halfway through, where the trail made a slight bend, Thomas pulled up short. His heart pounded against his ribs as he stared at the sight before him. Blocking the trail, arranged in a semicircle that left no path forward, were 10 mounted Apache warriors. Their faces were painted with ochre and black stripes, their expressions impassive. Each man carried a rifle or bow, and their leader, distinguishable by the eagle feathers in his hair, sat perfectly still on a paint pony at the center of the formation. Thomas's mind raced. The needle's eye was too narrow to turn Sadie around quickly. Running back the way he'd come would expose his back to their weapons. Fighting was suicide, 10 against 1 were odds no man could overcome. For several heartbeats, neither Thomas nor the Apache moved. The only sounds were the soft snorts of horses and the whisper of the wind through the canyon. Then, slowly, the leader raised his hand in a gesture that was neither a threat nor a greeting, but a command for Thomas to halt where he stood. Thomas remained still, his hand resting near his revolver, though he knew drawing it would mean his death. He had lived in Apache country long enough to know that if they had wanted to kill him outright, he would already be dead. Their deliberate display meant they wanted something else. The leader spoke a few words to one of his companions, a younger warrior with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. This man nudged his pony forward and addressed Thomas in accented but clear English. "You are the rancher from Crooked Arrow." It wasn't a question, but Thomas nodded. "I am. You cross this trail each day." Thomas nodded again, tension coiling in his chest. "Edo." The scarred warrior translated for the leader, who studied Thomas with intense dark eyes before speaking again. The translator turned back to Thomas. "Our chief, Nahilze, says you have reputation among our people as a fair man. Is this true?" Thomas considered his words carefully. Over the years, he had employed several Apache men during roundup season, paying them the same wages he paid his white hands. He had traded fairly with the people from the reservation when they brought blankets or crafts to sell. Once, he had intervened when a drunken cowboy had tried to assault an Apache woman in Copper Springs. "I try to be fair to all men," Thomas replied. The translator relayed his words, and Nahilze nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he spoke again, at greater length, his voice carrying the natural authority of a leader. "The chief says the soldiers hunt us. They burned our camp 2 days ago while the men were hunting. Women and children had to flee into the hills with nothing. The reservation is a place of sickness and hunger. We will not return." Thomas remained silent. The San Carlos Reservation had a well-earned reputation for corruption and misery. Disease was rampant, and the food supplies promised by the government often disappeared before reaching the people they were intended for. "The chief says you know this land. You know where the soldiers patrol. You know safe places." The translator paused, then delivered Nahilze's ultimatum. "You will help us reach the high country beyond the soldiers' reach, or you will die here, and we will take your horses and guns." Thomas stared at the impassive face of Nahilze. The request, or demand, placed him in an impossible position. Helping Apache who had left the reservation was a federal offense. If discovered, he could lose his ranch, his freedom, perhaps even his life. Refusing meant certain death here in this canyon, where his body might not be discovered for days. But beyond the practical considerations lay a more complex moral territory. Thomas had no love for the reservation system or the treatment of the Apache by the Army and the Indian agents. He had seen firsthand the results of broken promises and brutal policies. As the silence stretched between them, Thomas made his decision. He slowly removed his hand from near his revolver and placed it on his saddle horn in a deliberate gesture. "If I help you," he said carefully, "I want your word that no harm will come to my ranch or my men. And I want your word that no settlers will be attacked along the way." The translator conveyed his conditions to Nahilze, who considered them before giving a single, dignified nod. "The chief gives his word," the translator said. "No harm to your people or the settlers if you guide us safely." Thomas took a deep breath. What he was about to do would make him a traitor in the eyes of many, but he couldn't see another path forward that he could live with, or that would allow him to live at all. "I'll help you," he said, "but we can't go to my ranch. The Army patrols that area too often. I know another way." And with those words, Thomas Blackwood's predictable life, riding the same trail day after day between his ranch and town, veered onto a dangerous new path. The trail ahead was uncertain, fraught with risk and moral ambiguity. But as he looked into the determined eyes of the Apache leader, he knew there was no turning back. The sun was beginning its descent behind the western ridge as Thomas led the Apache band away from the Needle's Eye. He had made a split-second decision that could cost him everything, but instinct told him it was the right one, perhaps the only one that aligned with both survival and his sense of justice. Instead of continuing toward his ranch, Thomas guided them east along a seldom-used game trail that wound through a series of interconnected ravines. This route would keep them hidden from any cavalry patrols that might be searching the main trails. The Apache followed in single file, moving with the silent efficiency of men accustomed to evading pursuit. "My ranch hands will worry when I don't return," Thomas said to the scar translator as they navigated a particularly steep section. "I need to get word to them." The translator, who had introduced himself as Kianatso, relayed this to Nahilze. After a brief discussion, the chief nodded his consent. "Chief says when we reach safe place, one of our men can take message. But no betrayal, rancher. No betrayal," Thomas agreed. He had already crossed that line. As they rode, Thomas learned more about what had happened. The band had indeed left the San Carlos reservation after months of inadequate rations, disease, and harassment from corrupt Indian agents. Nahilze, a respected warrior in his early 30s, had led a group of families into the mountains to hunt and live as they once had. When army scouts discovered their camp, a confrontation led to the death of a soldier. Knowing what would follow, Nahilze had gathered the fighting men to draw the army away from the women and children who were hiding deeper in the mountains. "Where are your families now?" Thomas asked. "Safe place," Kianatso replied after consulting with Nahilze. "Place where old ones used to go when Spanish came. Chief wants to join them before snow comes to high country." Thomas understood. They were heading for the remote areas of the White Mountains, traditional Apache territory that was difficult to access and rarely patrolled by the army. If they could reach it before winter set in, they might survive independently, at least until the army inevitably found them again. As darkness fell, Thomas led them to a secluded box canyon he knew from hunting expeditions. A small spring provided water, and the steep walls offered protection and concealment. It was here that Thomas wrote a brief note to his foreman, Miguel Vasquez, explaining that he had encountered trouble on the trail and would be delayed by several days. He was deliberately vague, knowing that Miguel would understand enough to keep the ranch running, but not enough to implicate himself if the note fell into the wrong hands. A young Apache warrior took the note and disappeared into the night, promising to leave it where the ranch hands would find it without being seen. Thomas watched him go, wondering if he had just sent his alibi or sealed his fate. Around a small, carefully shielded fire, Thomas shared his supplies with the Apache. The peppermint candies he'd purchased in town were distributed among the warriors, who accepted them with solemn nods of thanks. As they ate strips of dried venison and drank coffee that Thomas brewed, Kianatso translated more of the story. 3 moons ago, new Indian agent came to San Carlos, he explained. This one worse than others. Takes food meant for people, sells it to traders. When people complain, he has soldiers put them in iron house. Thomas had heard rumors about the new agent, a political appointee named Willard Kemp, who had previously been dismissed from a similar position in the Dakota Territory amid accusations of theft and brutality. Children began to die from hunger sickness, Kianatso continued, his face impassive but his voice carrying an undercurrent of controlled anger. Medicine Man said we must leave or all will die. Chief Nahilze led 50 people away in night. Others wanted to come but were afraid. Thomas listened, thinking of the newspaper accounts that had described Nahilze's band as renegades and hostiles who had fled the civilizing influence of the reservation. The reality, as always, was more complex and more human than those simplified narratives. As the night deepened, the Apache warriors took turns standing watch while others slept. Thomas found himself unable to rest, his mind churning with the potential consequences of his actions. If he were caught aiding Nahilze's band, he would face charges of treason. The Crooked Arrow would be seized by the government. His ranch hands would be left without work or homes. The life he had built over 15 difficult years would be destroyed. Yet as he looked at the faces of the warriors around the dying fire, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. These were men fighting for their family's survival against a system designed to break them. How different was that from what he himself had done after the war, when he'd headed west with nothing but determination to build something of his own? Around midnight, Thomas finally dozed off, only to be awakened before dawn by Kianatso's hand on his shoulder. "Riders coming," the Apache said quietly. "Many horses." Thomas was instantly alert. He followed Kianatso to where Nahilze and two other warriors were crouched at the canyon entrance, listening intently. Though Thomas couldn't hear anything yet, he trusted their assessment. The Apache could detect sounds at distances that seemed impossible to most white men. "How many?" Thomas whispered. "Maybe 12, Kianatso replied after consulting with one of the scouts. "Coming from south. Soldiers." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air. If the cavalry was already searching this area, someone must have spotted their trail or reported seeing Apache warriors. The Box Canyon, while providing good concealment, had only one entrance. If the soldiers discovered them here, they would be trapped. "We need to move," Thomas said urgently. "There's another way out, but it's difficult." When Kianatso translated this, Nahilze gave Thomas a searching look as if assessing whether this might be a trap. After a moment, he nodded sharply and issued orders to his men. Within minutes, they had extinguished all traces of their fire and were preparing to move out. Thomas led them to the back of the canyon where a steep, almost invisible game trail switchbacked up the canyon wall. It was treacherous for horses, especially in the dim pre-dawn light, but it was their only option. One at a time, Thomas instructed, dismounting to lead Sadie up the precarious path. "Keep the horses calm." The Apache followed his example, each man leading his mount with expert care. They moved with such quiet efficiency that Thomas found himself impressed despite the tension of the moment. Even the horses seemed to understand the need for silence, placing their hooves carefully on the rocky trail. They were halfway up the canyon wall when they heard the cavalry patrol below. Thomas froze, signaling the others to do the same. From their elevated position, partially concealed by brush and rock outcroppings, they watched as a dozen soldiers in blue uniforms entered the Box Canyon, led by a grizzled sergeant. "Spread out and search the area," the sergeant ordered. "They've been here recently. See if you can determine which way they went." Thomas held his breath as the soldiers methodically searched the canyon floor. One trooper discovered the remains of their fire, calling the sergeant over to examine it. "Still warm," the sergeant observed. "They can't be far ahead. Johnson, take 2 men and ride back to report to the lieutenant. The rest of you mount up. We're continuing the pursuit." As the soldiers prepared to leave, one of them glanced up toward the canyon wall. Thomas instinctively pressed himself closer to the ground, feeling horribly exposed despite the partial cover. "Sergeant Riley," the soldier called. "I think I see something up on that ridge." Every muscle in Thomas's body tensed as the sergeant squinted up in their direction. Beside him, he could feel the Apache warriors silently preparing for a fight. If the sergeant spotted them, blood would be shed on both sides. But after a long moment, the sergeant shook his head. "Just rocks and shadows, Cooper. Your eyes are playing tricks on you in this light. Mount up." Thomas didn't move until the sounds of the cavalry patrol had faded completely. Only then did he release the breath he'd been holding and signal the others to continue their ascent. When they reached the top of the canyon wall, the eastern sky was brightening with the approaching dawn. Thomas knew they needed to find better cover before full daylight exposed them to any patrols searching the area. He led them toward a dense pine forest that crowned the ridge, where the trees would conceal their movement and obscure their tracks. As they rode deeper into the forest, Nahilze moved his horse alongside Thomas's. Through Kianatso, he asked a direct question. "Why do you help us, rancher? You risk much." It was a question Thomas had been asking himself through the long night. The answer came to him with surprising clarity. During the war, he began slowly, I was wounded at Shiloh and left for dead on the battlefield. A freed slave named Solomon found me and carried me to safety, though helping a Confederate soldier could have cost him his freedom or his life. When I asked him why he'd risked himself for me, he said, "There comes a time when a man must decide what kind of world he wants to live in and then act accordingly." Thomas met Nahilze's intense gaze. "I want to live in a world where people aren't left to starve because of the color of their skin or where they were born." After Kianatso translated, Nahilze was silent for a long moment. Then he reached over and gripped Thomas's forearm in a gesture of respect. "My grandfather said to judge a man not by his words, but by what he does when facing danger," Kianatso translated. "Chief says you have shown your true heart." The simple statement affected Thomas more deeply than he expected. In that moment, despite the danger surrounding them and the uncertain path ahead, he felt a clarity of purpose that had eluded him for years. As the sun rose fully above the eastern mountains, Thomas Blackwood, rancher, former Confederate soldier, and now fugitive from the United States government, led the Apache band deeper into the wilderness, committed to a course from which there might be no return. By midday, the October sun had burned away the morning chill, and Thomas's shirt clung to his back with sweat as he led the Apache band through the rugged terrain. They had been traveling steadily since dawn, keeping to the densest parts of the forest where the pine canopy shielded them from being spotted from a distance. The horses were tiring, forced to navigate around fallen logs and through thick underbrush rather than following established trails. Thomas called a halt when they reached a small, spring-fed stream that cut through the forest. As the men watered their horses, he conferred with Nahilze and Kianatso over their next move. "The cavalry will expect us to head east toward the White Mountains," Thomas explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "That's the most direct route to reach your families." Kianatso translated, and Nahilze studied the crude map with the tactician's eye before responding. "Chief says this is problem," Kianatso relayed. "Bluecoats know Apache ways. They will watch all trails to mountains." Thomas nodded. "That's why we need to do what they won't expect. I suggest we head north first toward the high desert plateau. There's less cover there, but also fewer patrols. We can circle back east after we've thrown them off our trail." It was a risky strategy. The plateau offered less water and vegetation, and they would be more visible if spotted. But it also provided faster travel and might give them the chance to create distance between themselves and their pursuers. After careful consideration, Nahilze agreed to the plan. As they prepared to move out, one of the younger warriors returned from scouting their back trail, speaking urgently to the chief. "Soldiers have found where we climbed out of canyon," Kianatso explained to Thomas. "They follow our trail now with Apache scout." Thomas felt his heart sink. An Apache scout working for the army would be able to read sign that white soldiers might miss. Their head start had just been significantly reduced. "How many men?" he asked. 8 soldiers, 1 scout. Moving fast. Thomas calculated quickly. The patrol was still outnumbered, but they would likely have better firearms and the authority of the U.S. government behind them. More importantly, they could send for reinforcements. "We need to split their force," Thomas decided. "Nahilze, select your 2 best riders. I'll go with them on a false trail to the east while you lead the main group north as planned. We'll rejoin you at Broken Skull Ridge in 2 days." When this was translated, Nahilze considered the plan with narrowed eyes. Thomas knew what he was thinking. This could be a trick, an opportunity for Thomas to escape or betray them. "I gave my word," Thomas said simply, meeting the chief's gaze. After a tense moment, Nahilze nodded and issued orders. 2 warriors, a weathered veteran named Taza and a younger, athletic man called Delgadito, were selected to accompany Thomas. With minimal delay, the group divided. Thomas, Taza, and Delgadito headed southeast, making little attempt to hide their trail, while Nahilze led the main band northward with more caution. Thomas and his companions rode hard for several hours, deliberately leaving clear tracks and occasionally dropping small items, a piece of cloth, a spent cartridge, to ensure their pursuers would follow them rather than Nahilze's group. They paused only briefly to rest the horses, pushing on even as the afternoon waned. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, they reached the edge of a vast plateau where the forest gave way to scattered juniper and pinyon pines. From this vantage point, Thomas could see for miles across the landscape. Far below, perhaps 2 miles back, he spotted the dust kicked up by their pursuers. "They're still following," he told Taza and Delgadito, pointing to the dust cloud. Both warriors nodded grimly. Thomas knew they couldn't maintain this pace indefinitely. The horses needed real rest, and they needed a plan beyond simply staying ahead of the patrol. "There's an abandoned mining camp in the next valley," he explained through gestures and his limited Apache vocabulary, supplemented by the few English words Taza seemed to understand. "We can shelter there for the night." The mining camp, when they reached it as darkness fell, consisted of 3 dilapidated shacks and the collapsed entrance to a played-out silver mine. Thomas had discovered it years earlier while tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on his calves. The place had been abandoned at least a decade ago, but one of the shacks still had a partial roof and wall sound enough to provide some shelter. They concealed the horses behind the largest shack and settled in to wait, sharing Thomas's dwindling supplies and a small amount of jerky that Delgadito produced from a pouch at his waist. No fire was risked, despite the growing cold of the October night. "How far to this broken skull ridge?" Thomas asked Taza, mimicking the shape of a ridge with his hands and using the few Apache words he knew for far and meeting. Taza seemed to understand. He pointed northwest and held up 2 fingers, 2 days' ride. Then he asked a question of his own, pointing to Thomas, and then making a sweeping gesture that encompassed the situation they found themselves in. "Why am I doing this?" Thomas interpreted. He considered how to explain across the language barrier. Finally, he pointed to himself, then to his leg where the old war wound occasionally troubled him, and then made a gesture like someone helping a fallen man to his feet. "Someone helped me once," he said simply. "Now I help others." Taza studied him for a long moment before giving a single nod of understanding. The older warrior then took the first watch while Thomas and Delgadito tried to get some rest on the hard dirt floor of the shack. Thomas's sleep was fitful, disturbed by dreams of pursuit and the faces of his ranch hands wondering what had become of him. He woke fully at the sound of Taza's soft warning. Outside, the first hint of pre-dawn light was creeping into the eastern sky. Taza pointed down the valley. In the dim light, Thomas could make out the shapes of riders approaching slowly, methodically searching the area. The patrol had caught up more quickly than he had anticipated. "We need to move," Thomas whispered, but Taza shook his head and pointed to the mine entrance, then made a circling motion with his finger. Thomas understood the strategy immediately. The collapsed mine entrance offered concealment, and if they could circle behind the patrol, they might escape undetected while the soldiers searched the empty shacks. They retrieved their horses as quietly as possible, leading them through a narrow ravine behind the mining camp and toward the partially collapsed mine entrance. The old timbers creaked ominously as they ducked inside with the horses, finding themselves in a short tunnel that ended in a cave-in about 20 feet in. It wasn't comfortable, but it would hide them from immediate detection. Through a gap in the timbers, Thomas watched as 4 soldiers dismounted and began searching the shacks while the others, including a man he assumed was the Apache scout, remained mounted, rifles ready. The sergeant in charge issued orders in a voice that carried clearly in the morning stillness. "Cooper, Johnson, check every building. Rivera, keep an eye on those ridges in case they're watching us. Harper, search for fresh sign around the perimeter." Thomas tensed as the soldier, named Harper, began methodically examining the ground, working his way toward the mine entrance. Beside him, Taza silently notched an arrow in his bow, a weapon that would make no sound if it became necessary to use it. Delgadito gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. Harper was less than 30 feet from their hiding place when a shout came from one of the shacks. "Sergeant Riley, found something here." The distraction gave Thomas a surge of hope. Harper turned away from the mine entrance and jogged back toward the shack. Through the gap, Thomas could see the soldiers gathering around something one of them had discovered. "Looks like they left in a hurry," the sergeant observed. That blood on the floor? Thomas exchanged a puzzled glance with Taza. There had been no blood when they'd sheltered in the shack. Yes, sir, came the reply. Looks fresh, too. And there's a bloody rag here. One of them must be wounded. Thomas suddenly understood. Delgadito had created a false trail inside the shack, using what appeared to be animal blood and perhaps one of the cloth scraps they'd been dropping to mark their trail. The young warrior gave a small, satisfied smile when Thomas looked at him with newfound appreciation. They can't have gone far with a wounded man, the sergeant decided. Rivera, take the scout and check the ridgeline to the east. The rest of you mount up. We'll sweep the valley beyond those rocks. Thomas and his companions remained motionless until the sound of hoofbeats had faded. Only then did they cautiously emerge from the mine entrance, leading their horses up a steep game trail that would take them in the opposite direction from the one the patrol had chosen. By midday, they had put several miles between themselves and the mining camp, traveling through increasingly rugged terrain where the risk of leaving discernible tracks was minimized by the rocky ground. They paused at a vantage point that offered a clear view of the back trail. No sign of pursuit, Thomas observed, scanning the landscape. I think your trick worked, Delgadito. Though the language barrier prevented direct communication, the shared experience of danger and escape had created a bond of mutual respect. When Delgadito offered Thomas a strip of jerky from his dwindling supply, the gesture carried the weight of acceptance. As they continued their journey toward Broken Skull Ridge, where they would rendezvous with Nahilze's group, Thomas found himself thinking of his ranch. By now, Miguel would have received his message and would be managing things in his absence. But how long could he stay away before questions were raised? What would happen to the Crooked Arrow if he never returned? These thoughts troubled him as they made camp that night in a sheltered draw, building a small, well-shielded fire that would be invisible from more than a few yards away. As they ate a meager supper, Taza seemed to sense Thomas's preoccupation. The older warrior studied him across the fire, then spoke a few words and made a gesture toward the south, the direction of Thomas's ranch. Yes, Thomas nodded. I'm worried about my home. Taza responded with another phrase, this time touching his chest over his heart, and then sweeping his arm to indicate the open land around them. Though Thomas couldn't understand the exact words, the meaning seemed clear. Home is in the heart, not just a place on the land. It was the philosophy of a people who had been forced to adapt to changing circumstances, to find home wherever they could make it. As Thomas wrapped himself in his blanket that night, he wondered if he would ever see the Crooked Arrow again, and if he did, whether he would view it with the same eyes after what he had experienced. The predictable life he had built over 15 years had been upended in a moment at the needle's eye, and whatever path lay ahead, there would be no returning to the simplicity of his daily ride between ranch and town. With that troubling thought, he drifted into uneasy sleep beneath a vast canopy of stars, a white man far from home in the company of warriors who until yesterday had been strangers, united now by common purpose and the threat of pursuit that would resume with the dawn. The reunion with Nahilze's group at Broken Skull Ridge occurred without incident. Thomas, Taza, and Delgadito arrived first, taking positions on the ridge that allowed them to observe all approaches. When Nahilze and the others appeared from the north the following afternoon, Thomas felt an unexpected sense of relief. The past days of tension, pursuit, and unfamiliar company had left him more drained than he had realized. Kianatso greeted them with the news that they too had evaded patrols, though it had required a difficult night crossing of the Devil's Backbone, a treacherous ridgeline that few white men would attempt even in daylight. Chief says your plan worked well, Kianatso translated as they gathered around a small fire that evening. Soldiers are confused, searching in wrong places. Thomas nodded, but his expression remained serious. It won't last. They'll eventually realize they've been misled and expand their search. He paused, considering their options. How far to where your families are hiding? After consulting with Nahilze, Kianatso pointed eastward. 3, maybe 4 days if weather stays good. Place called Shadow Canyon, in high country. Thomas knew the general area, though he had never ventured that deep into the White Mountains. It was remote territory difficult to access and easy to defend, a good choice for a temporary refuge. But reaching it would require crossing more exposed terrain before they could disappear into the mountain wilderness. The most dangerous part will be crossing the Carson Plateau, Thomas explained, sketching in the dirt again. It's open country for nearly 20 miles, with the stage road cutting through the middle. The Army maintains a regular patrol along that road. When this was translated, Nahilze frowned and spoke at length to Kianatso. Chief says women and children need supplies, Kianatso explained. Have been waiting many days already. Must reach them soon. Thomas understood the urgency. With winter approaching, the families hiding in the mountains would need additional provisions and warmer shelter. Delay could mean suffering or death, especially for the youngest and oldest members of the group. There might be a way, Thomas said slowly, an idea forming. But it would be risky, and it would require trust on both sides. He outlined his plan. Rather than avoiding the stage road entirely, they would use it to their advantage. Thomas would ride ahead alone to the Garrett homestead, which lay alongside the road about 15 miles east. The Garretts, Jacob and his wife Sarah, were Quakers who had settled in the territory 5 years earlier. They kept to themselves, but were known for treating everyone, regardless of race or background, with equal respect. More importantly, they were rumored to have helped runaway slaves during the war and might be sympathetic to the Apache situation. If the Garretts are willing, they could provide a wagon and supplies, Thomas explained. We could disguise some of your men as ranch hands accompanying me on a legitimate journey. The others could travel hidden in the wagon or parallel to the road at a safe distance. It would allow us to cross the plateau quickly in plain sight. It was an audacious plan, dependent on the Garrett's cooperation and the assumption that soldiers would be less likely to scrutinize a white rancher traveling openly on the main road. When Kianatso translated the proposal, Nahilze and his warriors engaged in intense discussion. Finally, Nahilze spoke directly to Thomas, with Kianatso translating. Chief says this plan puts much trust in white settlers. How can he be sure these Quaker people will not betray us to soldiers? It was a fair question. Thomas considered his response carefully. Jacob Garrett once told me that his faith teaches him to see that of God in every person, Thomas replied. When the Indian agent at San Carlos refused medical help during the fever outbreak 2 summers ago, the Garretts brought medicines to the reservation themselves against government orders. They risk their own safety to do what they believe is right. He paused, but I cannot guarantee their help. I can only ask. After further deliberation, Nahilze made his decision. We will try your plan, Kianatso translated. But Chief says if there is betrayal, you'll be first to die. Thomas nodded, accepting the condition. I'll leave at first light. The next morning, Thomas rode alone across the plateau, following the stage road openly for the first time since encountering Nahilze's band. It felt strange to travel exposed after days of hiding and evading patrols. He had left his rifle with the Apache group as a gesture of good faith, carrying only his revolver. The Garrett homestead came into view around midday, a modest but well-maintained house with several outbuildings, surrounded by fields where Jacob grew corn, beans, and hay. A creek provided irrigation and power for a small mill wheel. As Thomas approached, he saw Sarah Garrett hanging laundry while her husband repaired a fence nearby. Jacob straightened as Thomas rode up, shading his eyes against the sun. He was a tall man with a full beard streaked with gray, dressed in the simple clothing favored by Quakers. Thomas Blackwood, he called in greeting. This is an unexpected visit. Is all well? Thomas dismounted, suddenly aware of how he must appear after days on the trail. Unshaven, dusty, and tense. I need to speak with you and Sarah, he said without preamble. Privately. Something in Thomas's tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, for Jacob simply nodded. Come inside. Sarah, would he join us, please? In the Garrett's simple but comfortable kitchen, Thomas declined offers of food and coffee, instead laying out the situation as directly as he could. He explained his encounter with Nahilze's band, their desperate circumstances, and his decision to help them reach their families in the mountains. The Garretts listened without interruption, their expressions grave but not shocked. When Thomas finished, Sarah spoke first. "These are the same people who brought us those beautiful baskets last spring," she said softly. "Their children were thin even then." Jacob stroked his beard thoughtfully. "What the asks involves considerable risk, friend Thomas. The army would view such assistance as aiding hostiles." "I know," Thomas acknowledged. "I wouldn't ask if I saw another way." "They needn't ask," Jacob replied with quiet conviction. "Our conscience is clear on this matter. The treatment of the native peoples has been a stain upon this nation." He turned to his wife. "Sarah," she nodded firmly. "We will help. The large wagon can be ready within 2 hours. I'll prepare food provisions." Relief washed over Thomas. "Thank you. There's one more thing. We'll need clothes. Wear clothes like ranch hands might wear, for about 4 men." By late afternoon, Thomas was leading the Garrett's wagon back toward Broken Skull Ridge, with Jacob driving and Sarah remaining at the homestead. The wagon was loaded with supplies hidden beneath sacks of grain: flour, coffee, salt, beans, ammunition, blankets, and warm clothing. Nahilze was understandably wary when Thomas returned with another white man, but Jacob's calm demeanor and willingness to come alone as a show of good faith gradually eased the tension. Through Kianatso, Jacob explained that his religious beliefs commanded him to love thy neighbor, regardless of race or circumstance. "My people have also known persecution," he told Nahilze. "In England, many Quakers were imprisoned or killed for their beliefs. In America, some were hanged in Boston. We understand what it means to seek freedom to live according to one's conscience." When this was translated, Nahilze studied Jacob for a long moment before offering his hand in the white man's fashion, a significant gesture from an Apache leader to a settler. They worked quickly to implement the plan. For warriors, including Kianatso, donned the ranch clothes provided by the Garretts. Their hair was tied back, and they smudged their faces with dirt to partially disguise their features. The remaining 6 warriors, including Nahilze, concealed themselves beneath the grain sacks in the wagon or rode hidden among the supplies. Remember, Thomas instructed Kianatso and the others who would be visible: "If we encounter soldiers, let me do the talking. Act tired, like men who've been working cattle for days." As dusk approached, their unusual caravan set out onto the main stage road. Thomas and Jacob riding on the wagon seat, the disguised Apache ranch hands on horseback alongside, and the others hidden from view. They traveled through the night to minimize the chance of encounters, the moon providing just enough light to follow the road. Near dawn, as they approached the eastern edge of the plateau where the road began to wind into the foothills of the White Mountains, Thomas spotted the glow of a campfire ahead. He signaled for the wagon to halt. "Soldiers," he whispered, recognizing the distinctive shape of a military tent in the dim light. It was a small outpost, probably manned by just a few troopers, established to monitor traffic on the road. There was no way around it without leaving the road and crossing open terrain where they would be easily spotted once daylight came. "We must go through," Jacob said quietly. "If we turn back now, it will only raise suspicion." Thomas nodded grimly. "Stay calm and follow my lead. Kianatso, tell the others in the wagon to remain absolutely still and silent." As they approached the outpost, a soldier emerged from beside the road, rifle in hand. "Halt and identify yourselves." Thomas raised his hand in a casual greeting. "Thomas Blackwood from the Crooked Arrow Ranch. This is Jacob Garrett. We're transporting supplies to my line cabin in the Eastern Range." The soldier, a young corporal, stepped closer, eyeing the wagon and the mounted men. "You're out early, Mr. Blackwood. Or late, depending on how you look at it. Traveling at night is cooler on the horses," Thomas replied easily. "Plus, I've got cattle to check on that pasture beyond the foothills." The corporal seemed satisfied with this explanation, but continued with what was clearly a routine inquiry. "Seen any sign of Apache in your travels? There's a band of hostiles been reported in the area." Thomas forced himself to maintain a casual demeanor. "Haven't seen any sign, though I heard about the trouble from San Carlos." "That true?" "Yes, sir, it is. Lieutenant Chambers has 2 full patrols out searching." The corporal glanced at Kianatso and the other disguised warriors. "Your hands look tired, Mr. Blackwood." "Been a long drive," Thomas said, feeling his heart rate accelerate. "These boys have earned their pay this week." There was a tense moment as the corporal continued to study the ranch hands, his gaze lingering on Kianazzo. Thomas felt his hand drift toward his revolver, knowing that if fighting broke out, they might win this immediate encounter, but would have the entire army bearing down on them afterward. Then Jacob spoke up, his Quaker cadence distinctive. "Friend, might we continue our journey? The Lord has blessed us with good weather, but I fear it may not hold." Something about Jacob's calm, dignified manner seemed to reassure the corporal. He stepped back and waved them through. "Safe travels, gentlemen. Keep an eye out for hostiles and report any sightings at Fort Wendell if you head that way." "Will do," Thomas replied, flicking the reins to set the wagon in motion before the soldier could change his mind. They maintained their unhurried pace until the outpost was well behind them, then urged the horses to a faster trot. No one spoke until they had entered the relative safety of the forested foothills. "That was close," Thomas finally said, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Jacob nodded solemnly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, friend Thomas." From beneath the grain sacks, Nahilze emerged, speaking rapidly to Kianazzo. "Chief says the Quaker man has strong medicine," Kianazzo translated. Soldier looked right at me, but did not see Apache. Jacob shook his head. "Not medicine, friend. Just the truth delivered plainly. Even a soldier can sense when a man speaks from his heart." They continued into the mountains, the terrain growing steeper and more challenging for the wagon. By midday, they had reached a point where the road narrowed significantly as it wound through a series of switchbacks. "The wagon can't go much farther," Thomas observed. "The trail ahead is too narrow and steep." After discussion, they decided to unload the supplies and continue on horseback. Jacob would return to his homestead with the empty wagon, maintaining the fiction of having delivered goods to Thomas's line cabin. As they transferred bundles of supplies to the horses, Jacob took Thomas aside. "I sense he has not fully considered what comes after, friend Thomas," he said quietly. "Once these people reach their destination, what then? Winter approaches. The army will not cease their pursuit." Thomas had indeed been focused on the immediate goal of reaching Shadow Canyon, avoiding deeper thoughts about the future. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I couldn't just let them be hunted down or sent back to starve at San Carlos." Jacob placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Thy heart is in the right place. But remember, temporary solutions to permanent problems often lead to greater suffering." He paused. "Sarah and I will help however we can. There are others, too, who might stand against injustice if given the opportunity." The idea took root in Thomas's mind, that perhaps this impromptu alliance with the Garretts might expand, that others might be persuaded to support a more lasting solution than simply hiding in the mountains until the next crisis. As they said their farewells, Jacob pressed a sealed envelope into Thomas's hand. A letter to a friend in Washington, a congressman with influence on Indian affairs. If he finds a way to send it, it might help shed light on the conditions at San Carlos. Thomas tucked the letter into his shirt. "Thank you, Jacob, for everything." "Walk in the light, friend Thomas," Jacob replied, using the Quaker farewell. Then he turned the wagon and began the journey back toward the plateau. With the Garrett supplies distributed among their horses, Thomas and the Apache band continued deeper into the White Mountains. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, the pine forest thicker, the air noticeably cooler at the higher elevation. They followed game trails and ancient Apache paths that weren't marked on any white man's map. Late on the afternoon of the second day, after parting from Jacob, they crested a ridge and looked down into a deep, narrow valley, Shadow Canyon. Thomas could make out thin wisps of smoke rising from what must be carefully shielded fires, and the distant figures of people moving among a cluster of wickiups built in a sheltered section of the canyon. Nahilze raised his hand, and one of the warriors gave a series of calls that echoed across the valley, signals that told those below that their men were returning and that it was safe to show themselves. Figures emerged from hiding places, women and children gathering at the center of the camp. As Thomas watched, he saw the moment when they recognized Nahilze and the others. The gestures of relief, the children running forward, the community reunited after days of separation and uncertainty. "Come," Kianatso said to Thomas. "You will be honored guest." As they rode down into the canyon, Thomas felt the weight of many eyes upon him. The only white man entering this temporary Apache settlement. There was wariness in those gazes, but also curiosity. The reunion was emotional but restrained, in keeping with Apache custom. Nahilze embraced an older woman, his mother, Thomas guessed, and a young woman with an infant secured in a cradleboard on her back, presumably his wife and child. Kianatso was greeted by two young boys who ran to him, touching his legs as if to confirm he was really there. Thomas remained mounted, uncertain of his place in this intimate moment, until Nahilze approached and gestured for him to dismount. "Chief says you are welcome here," Kianatso translated. "You have helped bring fathers back to children, husbands to wives. This is thing Apache, do not forget." That night, as Thomas sat beside a small fire, eating a stew of venison and wild onions prepared by Nahilze's mother, he looked around at the faces illuminated by the flickering light. Men, women, children, elders, about 50 people in all, try to live as their ancestors had, free from the constraints and deprivations of the reservation. He thought of Jacob Garrett's question, what comes after? These people could not stay here indefinitely. When winter came in full force, this high canyon would become nearly uninhabitable. The army would eventually widen their search to include even this remote location. As if reading his thoughts, Kianatso sat down beside him. "You think of tomorrow," he observed. Thomas nodded. "Winter is coming. The soldiers will keep searching." "Yes," Kianatso agreed. "But tomorrow's troubles belong to tomorrow. Tonight, we are here, we are together, we have food." He offered Thomas a small leather pouch. "Smoke." Thomas accepted the tobacco pouch, rolling a cigarette with the papers from his shirt pocket. As they smoked in companionable silence, he found himself thinking of the crooked arrow. By now, his unexplained absence would have raised questions in Copper Springs. The army might even be questioning his ranch hands about his whereabouts. And yet, sitting here in this Apache camp, farther from his own world than he had ever imagined being, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, perhaps since the war, he had acted purely on conviction rather than convenience or convention. "Your people have a home to return to," Kianatso said eventually. "We have only this." He gestured around the camp. The statement held no self-pity, only a clear-eyed assessment of reality. It stirred something in Thomas, a determination that had been building since he'd first made the decision at Needles Eye not to abandon these people to their fate. "What if there was another way?" he said slowly. "Not San Carlos, not hiding in the mountains, but something else?" Kianatso looked at him with interest. "What way is this?" Thomas wasn't sure yet, but pieces were coming together in his mind. Jacob's letter to the congressman, the Garrett's willingness to help, his own standing in the territory as a respected rancher. Perhaps there was a path that didn't end in either surrender or bloodshed. "I need to think on it more," Thomas replied. "But I believe there might be a way for your people to live in peace, with dignity, if enough voices speak up for justice." Kianatso studied him thoughtfully before responding. "Apache have heard many promises from white men. Most turn to dust like tracks in desert. I understand your doubt," Thomas acknowledged. "But not all white men are the same, just as not all Apache are the same. There are people like the Garretts who believe in treating all men fairly. If enough of us stand together, perhaps we can make a difference." It was a fragile hope, perhaps even a naive one. But as Thomas looked around at the families gathered in Shadow Canyon, people who wanted nothing more than the freedom to raise their children according to their own traditions and to live without the constant specter of hunger and disease, he knew he had to try. In that moment, far from the predictable routine of his ranch life, Thomas Blackwood made a silent commitment. The path that had begun at the Needle's Eye, when he'd found 10 Apache warriors blocking his way, would not end here in this remote canyon. Somehow, he would find a way to help these people secure a future with dignity, or he would die trying. The days at Shadow Canyon fell into an unexpected rhythm. What Thomas had initially envisioned as a brief stay lengthened as he became more involved with the Apache band situation. He found himself drawn into their daily life, learning more about their customs and helping to improve their temporary settlement. His knowledge of the territory proved valuable as they established hunting parties and gathering expeditions. Though the Apache were skilled at living off the land, the addition of the supplies brought from the Garrets had significantly improved their circumstances. There was now enough food to last well into winter, if carefully rationed. Thomas's presence was initially met with reservation by some of the older members of the band, particularly a medicine man named Nanton, who viewed any white man with understandable suspicion. But as days passed, Thomas's willingness to work alongside the man, his respect for their ways, and his obvious commitment to helping them gradually earned a measure of acceptance. The children were the first to warm to him completely. Fascinated by his red beard, a feature uncommon among their people, and his ability to whistle tunes they had never heard, they began to follow him around the camp. Thomas taught them to play horseshoes using improvised equipment, while they taught him Apache words and showed him how to find edible plants in the forest. Through these children, and through longer conversations with Kianatso, Thomas learned more about life at San Carlos and why Nahilze had led his people away. The conditions had been worse than even the rumors suggested. Corrupt agents who sold government-issued food and blankets for personal profit, military officers who treated any complaint as insubordination, and a policy of punishing those who attempted to maintain traditional ceremonies or practices. "My father died at San Carlos," Kianatso told him one evening as they repaired a damaged wickiup. "Not from disease or hunger. Oh, many die that way. He died from." He searched for the English word, heartbreak. To see his people living like prisoners, dependent on handouts that often did not come, unable to hunt or perform the ceremonies that kept us connected to our ancestors in the land. He secured a pine branch in place with sinew. A man can survive hunger of the belly, but not hunger of the spirit. Thomas thought of his own father, who had never recovered his will to live after their family plantation in Tennessee was destroyed during the war. He had understood, even as a young man, that it wasn't just the loss of property that had broken his father, but the loss of purpose and pride. "I think I understand," he said quietly. Kianatso nodded. "This is why Chief Nahilze led us away. Better to die free than live as beggars in a prison without walls." As Thomas became more integrated into the daily life of the camp, he observed the strength of the community bonds among the Apache. Despite their difficult circumstances, there was a clear structure to their society. Decisions were made collectively, with Nahilze and the elders guiding rather than dictating. Children were raised by the entire community, with older children helping to care for younger ones. Food was shared equally, with special attention paid to ensuring that the elderly and the youngest members of the band received what they needed. It was during his second week at Shadow Canyon that Thomas's relationship with the band faced its first serious test. A hunting party returned to camp in disarray, one man wounded in the shoulder by a bullet. Through Kianatso's translation, Thomas learned that they had encountered an army patrol much closer to the canyon than any had been seen before. "They say soldiers have set up camp at Three Pines Junction," Kianatso explained, referring to a location less than 10 miles from Shadow Canyon. Many soldiers with Apache scouts. Nahilze called a council that evening. Thomas was included, a sign of the trust he had earned. The discussion was intense, with various perspectives offered on how to respond to this new threat. Some of the younger warriors advocated for a preemptive attack on the soldiers' camp, arguing that surprise would give them an advantage. Others suggested moving deeper into the mountains, though all knew that higher elevations would become increasingly dangerous as winter approached. A few voices even raised the possibility of splitting the band into smaller groups to make detection more difficult, though this would also make them more vulnerable. Throughout the discussion, Thomas listened carefully, trying to understand the nuances that Kianatso's translations couldn't fully convey. When Nahilze finally turned to him and asked for his thoughts, Thomas spoke thoughtfully. The soldiers at Three Pines Junction are likely in advance camp for a larger operation, he began. If you attack them, even successfully, it will bring the full force of the army down on this area. They would view it as confirmation that you are hostile. He paused, considering his next words carefully. But I don't believe they've located Shadow Canyon yet. The patrol that wounded Toddy was following game trails, not tracking your people specifically. This gives us time, not much, but some, to consider options beyond fighting or fleeing deeper into mountains that will soon be covered in snow. Thomas then shared an idea that had been forming since his conversation with Jacob Garrett. There's a third path, he suggested, one that involves neither surrender to San Carlos nor war with the army. He outlined a bold proposal. Using Jacob's letter to the congressman as a starting point, they could bring attention to the conditions at San Carlos while simultaneously proposing an alternative. Thomas believed that with the right advocacy, it might be possible to secure permission for Nahilze's band to settle on a portion of the Crooked Arrow Ranch, away from the reservation, but under the nominal supervision of trusted civilians rather than the corrupt Indian Bureau. My ranch has more land than I can use, Thomas explained. There's a fertile valley with good water on the eastern boundary, far enough from town to provide privacy, but close enough to allow for trade. You could live there according to your own customs, while I would serve as a liaison with the territorial authorities. It was an unprecedented suggestion, a private arrangement outside the reservation system, and Thomas knew it faced significant obstacles. The Indian Bureau would resist any exception to their authority. Many settlers would oppose having free Apache living near their communities. The army would question the security implications. But Thomas also believed there were factors in their favor. The Indian Bureau was facing increasing criticism in Washington for its corruption and mismanagement. The ongoing conflicts with tribes across the West were expensive and unpopular with Eastern voters. A peaceful solution that cost the government nothing might appeal to pragmatic officials. It would require negotiation, Thomas acknowledged, and trust on both sides. But it offers a chance for your people to live with dignity, neither confined to San Carlos nor forced to hide in the mountains. When Kianazzo finished translating, silence fell over the council. The proposal was so unexpected, so different from the binary options of resistance or surrender that had defined Apache-white relations for decades, that it took time for the implications to be processed. Nanton, the medicine man who had been most skeptical of Thomas, was the first to respond. He spoke at length, his weathered face grave. Kianazzo translated. Nanton says your words sound good, like rain after long drought. But he has heard good words from white men before. The treaty at Camp Grant was made with good words. Then white men came in night and killed many Apache, even children. Why should we believe these good words when not also turn to blood? It was a fair question, one that Thomas had anticipated. The difference is that this arrangement would not depend on distant officials who never have to look you in the eye, he replied. It would be between us, people who have shared food and fire, who have fought alongside each other. I stake my honor and my life on keeping my word. The discussion continued late into the night. There were many questions, legitimate concerns, and competing viewpoints. Some, particularly among the younger warriors, were suspicious of any solution that involved cooperation with whites. Others, especially those with children, were drawn to the possibility of a stable future that didn't require constant flight. Nahilze listened more than he spoke, weighing each perspective. When he finally addressed the council, his words carried the weight of a leader who had considered all angles. The rancher has proven himself a friend, Kianazzo translated. He could have betrayed us many times, but did not. His plan has risk, but so does staying here or fighting the soldiers. At least his way offers hope for children to grow up without fear. Nahilze looked directly at Thomas. But Chief says such arrangement must protect Apache ways. We cannot become like white men, wearing your clothes, speaking your language, following your God. We must remain Apache. Thomas nodded solemnly. That is exactly what I intend. Your people would live according to your traditions, on land where you can hunt, gather, and raise your children in your own ways. I would be a buffer between you and the outside world, not a ruler. After further discussion, a consensus gradually emerged. They would pursue Thomas's plan, but with caution. The first step would be getting Jacob's letter to the congressman in Washington, along with additional documentation of conditions at San Carlos and a formal proposal for the alternative arrangement. The immediate challenge, however, was the military presence at Three Pines Junction. With patrols likely to increase, they needed to establish a secure line of communication with the outside world and prepare for the possibility that they might need to defend Shadow Canyon or evacuate on short notice. I should return to my ranch, Thomas said. From there, I can send Jacob's letter, speak with territorial officials I know, and begin preparing the valley for your people. This triggered another intense discussion. Some viewed Thomas's departure as abandonment or even potential betrayal. Others saw the strategic necessity of having an advocate in the white world. Again, it was Nihilze who made the final decision. Chief says you may go, Kianatso translated, but Taza and I will accompany you to ensure your safe return. And as he searched for the right word, witnesses to your actions among your people. Thomas understood. It was a reasonable precaution, sending trusted warriors to observe him and report back, while also providing protection on the journey. Agreed, he said. We should leave at dawn tomorrow. The sooner we begin, the better chance we have of success. That night, as Thomas prepared for the journey, Nihilze's wife, Ishkene, approached him with a small deerskin pouch. Through gestures and the few Apache words Thomas had learned, she indicated it was a gift for him, a medicine bundle containing herbs and small objects of spiritual significance to protect him on his journey. Though Thomas didn't share the Apache spiritual beliefs, he accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, recognizing it as a significant gesture of acceptance. Dawn broke clear and cold over Shadow Canyon. Thomas, Kianatso, and Taza prepared to depart, loading their horses with enough provisions for the journey to the Crooked Arrow. The mood in the camp was solemn. Everyone understood the stakes of this mission. As they mounted up, Nihilze approached and spoke directly to Thomas, with Kianatso translating. Chief says remember your promises. Many lives depend on your true heart. If you return with soldiers, we will fight to last man, woman, and child. It was both a reminder of trust and a warning. Tomash med nahil sheish gay steadily. I gave my word. I'll return with a path to peace, not with soldiers. With a final nod of acknowledgement, Nihilze stepped back. Thomas, Kianatso, and Taza rode out of Shadow Canyon as the sun crested the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the land. The journey ahead would take them through territory increasingly patrolled by the army, back to a world where Thomas would have to explain his prolonged absence and begin the delicate process of advocating for an unprecedented arrangement. As they crested the ridge above the canyon and Thomas took a last look at the settlement below, he was struck by how his life had changed in the weeks since that fateful encounter at the Needle's Eye. The predictable routine of his ranching days had been replaced by a mission that challenged everything he had taken for granted about the territory he called home and his place within it. Whatever happened in the days ahead, Thomas knew he could never return to being the man who rode the same trail daily without questioning the world around him. That man had disappeared at the moment he'd chosen to help 10 Apache warriors blocking his path, replaced by someone who had glimpsed a different kind of future for the land he loved. One where justice might finally take precedence over convenience and tradition.